when I think about just recent events, I mean, Ahmaud Arbery was jogging, Christian Cooper was birding, George Floyd had 3 people standing on his lungs. These are very visceral examples of how people of color have very little agency, very little ability to access recreation and health, and don't have freedom of movement in their communities. I think that's what we're seeing more than anything right now in the Black experience. And there's a really sort of rich range of how environmental justice shows up for people of color, whether it's, say, in Vermont, Black Jamaicans on apple orchards, or Latinx migrant farm workers, mostly on dairy farms, or Indigenous people who stay really close to the land. There's a lot of erasure of the fact that people of color are often the ones laboring in the earth and who understand it the best. There are a lot of ways in which the environmental justice movement started in rural areas because it's easier to hide pollution and undesirable land use in poorer, more rural areas, and all of a sudden have an accumulation of burdens that really reduce quality of life. And so you see the environmental justice movement starting in North Carolina and southern places where you could sweep things into communities that are less politically powerful. So we in Vermont shouldn't automatically assume, well, we're rural, we don't have the same environmental justice issues. It's not as obvious as when you're in cities and you have, refineries next to an elementary school of Black and brown kids. But rural environmental injustice is very much present here. Some of the issues that I think are still really prevalent are really center, in my mind, on mobile home communities, migrant farm workers, and Indigenous folks. I think with mobile home communities, you have a lot of intersection of disaster, lack of disaster preparedness and resiliency, lack of access to clean natural resources and healthy homes to live in. And 8% of Vermont's population, at least at the time of Irene, lived in mobile homes, and they were 40% of who was affected in Irene. So it continues to be a really big part of the population that's often left behind in environmental solutions and planning. And then with migrant farm workers, you end up, having deep environmental hazards in the workplace. Not having a laundry machine has come up quite a bit for migrant farm workers. They are living, sleeping, and working in the same place for the most part, which has a lot of agricultural toxins for 6+ days a week, and maybe get a small break to go do something. And we've tried to pass laws to help them be able to use a day off to go to the grocery store or to church or to see family or just have mobility. And that's incredibly challenging for them. Even if we say, like, we support driver's privilege cards for non-citizens, they are just much more scared, especially in this moment of being stopped. So, maybe don't take as many chances to leave the farm. Don't even get medical care, let's say if they've been kicked by an animal or something like that. So we're just excavating a lot of environmental hazards for migrant farm workers. And then, with Indigenous populations, they are still here. They're rendered kind of invisible in Vermont. And so that erases their access to land, their ability to pass on traditional knowledge and things like that. I live much more in the story than the sort of hard data, but it's really valuable to balance the two, because, I think it's just really changing this frame of Vermont exceptionalism. Like, we're the only state that doesn't have these problems somehow, because we're 80% forested, we're very green, et cetera. So, it's more like we have asbestos mines, we have, old diesel contaminated sites. We have the same pollutants that other places have, maybe not the same scale, but around those things, you still have low-income people and people of color who are kind of pushed into areas that are less desirable and blighted. I think everyone in the state at some point should go on a Indigenous history tour and understand the eugenics movement, and understand what it was like to have your basic healthcare be a source of sterilization, humiliation, and complete violation. That is a deep experience in history that we live with but don't often acknowledge in Vermont. And so as we look around the country at symbolic gestures to bring statues down and to shed some light on really dark times, we have a lot of work to do in Vermont. It's not just other places.